So this is how to create a simple 2D character controller in Unity. Let's dive right in. Okay, so I've got a little scene set up with a character and a little tile map with some colliders on it. And if we hit start, we don't expect anything to happen. And there we go. As expected, nothing happens. Cool. So to our little character game object that I've got here, I'm going to add a capsule collider 2D. And I'm going to add a rigid body 2D component. In my rigid body 2D component, I'm going to freeze the rotation on the Z axis so that our character doesn't roll over. And now when we press the start button, we've got our character, he's got gravity applied to him, but currently nothing happens when we hit any move inputs. So I've got a scripts folder, and down here, I'm going to create two new scripts. Firstly, I'm going to create a input handler script, player input handler script. I'm going to create another script called character controller. Then I'm going to open up our player input handler script. And in here, we're using the new Unity input system. So I'm going to say using Unity engine.input system. Okay. And then I'm going to declare two variables, one for the move action and one for the jump input action. So I'm just going to type here private input action, move action, and jump action. Then in the awake of this mono behavior class, I'm going to say move action equals input system dot actions dot find action move. And then I'm going to say jump action equals input system dot actions dot find action jump. Quick disclaimer, this is a quick fire tutorial. If you'd like the more detailed in-depth one, I will add it on screen now. Okay, because our jump action is a button, we can subscribe to the performed event. So we can just say jump action.performed plus equals jump. And then we'll need to define that function. So to define that function, we can say private void jump input action dot callback context. And then inside of here, we're going to need to call our character controller's jump, which we'll do after we define our character controller. And then in our update function, we're going to define a vector2 move vector. And we're going to say move action dot read value of type vector2. Oops. And then once we've got that value, we're going to need to call our character's move function, right? So I'm just going to hit save on that. Then I'm going to open up our player character controller. And in here, we're going to need to do a couple of things. Firstly, let's define some variables that we can change in the editor. So we're going to use a private float underscore movement speed. And we'll set that to default 5, and a jump force, which we will set to a default of 5 as well. We've added the serialized field attribute here so that we can see these values in the editor. Next, we're going to need a private rigid body 2D rigid body. And then in our start, we're going to just assign our rigid body to the get component of our rigid body 2D. So this will just get the rigid body 2D component that we added to our character earlier. And then because we're going to be affecting physics, we want to define our fixed update function. And inside of here, we're also going to need to create a variable of type vector2. And we'll call this move vector. Okay, and then we're going to define a public void move, which is going to take in a vector2 move vector. And this is what we're going to call from our player input handler. We've defined these in two separate scripts so that we can use the same character controller for our AI in the future. And not everything is locked to the input inside of our character controller. So when we call our move function, all we want to do is we want to set our movement vector equal to the passed in movement vector. And then in our fixed update, we want to say rigid body dot linear velocity x equals move vector dot x multiplied by our movement speed, right? And then in here, we also want to have a Boolean variable called jump requested, and we'll default that to false. And then we'll also define a public void jump function with a, okay, that's all we need to do. And then inside of our jump function, we're just gonna set our jump requested variable to true. And then in our fixed update method, what we're gonna do is we're gonna check if jump requested, oops, then we wanna say rigid body dot linear velocity on the y-axis equals our jump force, and then we want to set our jump requested value back to false. Alrighty, so that should be all we need for our character controller. Now we'll just head back into our player input handler, and here what we're going to define is a private character controller underscore character controller, and in our awake we'll just assign our character controller to our get component character controller, because we're going to add our character controller and our input handler to our character in a moment. And then all we're going to do is we're going to say character controller dot jump in our jump function. So when the jump button is pressed, the character will jump. And then in our update function, we're going to call character controller dot move, and we're going to pass in the movement vector. And then back in Unity, if we want to take a look at what input actions are defined in the new input system, we can go to edit, project settings, input system package, and here we can see all of our different actions. Our move action is over here, and we can see it's of type vector2, and our jump action is over here, and we can see it's of type button. Okay, so I'm just going to save this. Then on our character, I'm going to drag in our character controller, and I'm going to drag in our player input handler. I'm going to hit save. And now when we press start, woo, we can move our character around, and when we hit spacebar, the character jumps. He's super floaty right now, but we can change that by just affecting the gravity scale on our character. So we can increase this to something like 3, and there we go. He's got a bit more of a heavy jump, and if we wanted to increase the force on that jump, we could just increase this to like 10, and then he's got a heavier jump and he falls much faster. Cool, and that is a very quick fire how to create a simple 2D character controller in Unity. You can find the source code on my Patreon. It's available to all of my Patreon subscribers. Thank you guys so much for all the support. You're the best. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.